In 1952, Heinlein wrote 19 predictions about the future. You can find it online on various sites. Generally, it is presented alone, although it was actually only one part of a larger article about the future. I figured I would look at the predictions and rate them. Firstly, a little background. These predictions were published in the February 1952 issue of Galaxy, although I have found some sources online claiming that the article was written in the year 1949. Heinlein starts with a story about the reader visiting 3 homes. The first 50 years ago, around the turn of the century, the second in the present day 50s, and the third, which of course has most of the attention devoted to it, in the year 2000. Here the reader spends a day visiting his own granddaughter in the year 2000. This story really helps contextualize and clarify some of the predictions, which is why it is unfortunate that most of the discussion of these predictions online don't mention it at all. So I will be referring to it as I discuss them. By the way, Heinlein doesn't seem to put his predictions in any sort of order, but I will be dividing them into categories for convenience, and thus will not be discussing them in the order he gave. Another point, even though Heinlein places his predictions in the year 2000, I'm willing to give him a couple of decades slack, so I'll be judging his predictions correct if they have been fulfilled by the present day. Futurology is a difficult art, and I figure a couple of decades leeway is permissible. We'll start with the predictions about space travel. Optimism ahoy! 1. Interplanetary travel is waiting at your front door. COD. It's yours when you pay for it. 3. The most important military fact of this century is that there is no way to repel an attack from outer space. 10. By the end of this century, mankind will have explored this solar system, and the first ship intended to reach the next star will be a building. 12. Intelligent life will be found on Mars. Well, this is a depressing start, isn't it? Now, in Heinlein's defense, extreme optimism about space travel was almost universal in the third quarter of the last century, at least in part driven by the extraordinary achievements made during the 60s with the moon landing and such. Interestingly, however, Heinlein is making his predictions in 1952, before any actual space travel had happened. Of course, whilst I would say space travel optimism reached its peak in the aftermath of Apollo, a lot of science fiction before that was still very optimistic about the matter, as a short look through the passages of any Gold Age science fiction magazine shows. Now, I have come across some online saying that these predictions might not seem such failures if we consider the achievements of space probes. They have, after all, at least bypassed every planet in our solar system and have made many landings. So one could argue that the first half of prediction 10 has been fulfilled. But it's clear that Heinlein was not imagining space travel being conducted with unmanned craft. As a matter of fact, very little early science fiction seems to anticipate the extensive use of space probes. I suspect this is partly due to the general failure to anticipate the impact of computers, as well as the fact that they rather ruin stories. Even in much later science fiction, such as Star Trek, the role of space probes was minimized, since it is much more interesting for our heroes to make the first exploration themselves, rather than leaving the job to robots. So, overall these predictions are fails. The closest to coming true is probably number 3. Spy and communication satellites do have important military purposes. Even that falls very short of what Heinlein clearly imagined, though. So much for space. Now let's look at some other predictions about science and technology. 5. In 15 years, the housing shortage will be solved by a breakthrough into new technologies, which will make every house now standing as obsolete as privies. So the post-war housing shortage was indeed solved fairly quickly, but it didn't require any such technological breakthrough to do so. I actually don't know much about house building techniques or in what way they've changed since the 1950s, but I don't think there's been any huge colossal change that would make every house before 1950 obsolete. 8. Freud would be classed as a pre-scientific, intuitive pioneer, and psychoanalysis will be replaced by a growing, changing, operational psychology based on measurement and predictions. So, I'm not a psychologist, but from my reading of psychologists, I would say that if anything, this is overly generous to the opinion of Freud in the field. Although this may simply reflect the particular psychologists that I use for my research. Certainly, however, his ideas are rarely used to actually treat people nowadays. Although it has to be said that outside of psychology, in English departments, Freud still has some utterly undeserved, in my opinion, credibility. Although even that seems to be fading. I'll call that a win for Heinlein. 9. Cancer, the common cold, and tooth decay will be conquered. The revolutionary new problem in medical research will be to accomplish regeneration, i.e., to enable man to grow a new leg rather than to fit him with artificial limb. Wrong on all counts, not really much more to say. 11. Your personal telephone will be small enough to carry in your handbag. Your house telephone will record messages, answer simple inquiries, and transmit vision. This is one of the cases where my willingness to grant Heinlein 20 years of leeway helps him a little. In the year 2000, this wasn't quite true yet, as mobile phones were still owned by only a small minority, and whilst answering machines could record messages, they could not answer simple inquiries. Now, however, it has been fulfilled, indeed, more than fulfilled, in every detail. 13. 1,000 miles an hour at a centre mile will be commonplace. Small hauls will be made in evacuated subways at extreme speed. Once again, way too optimistic. 14. A major objective of applied physics will be to control gravity. Not really. I mean, I'm sure we would like to do it, but from my limited understanding, this isn't regarded as likely any time in the near future by researchers. 17. All aircraft will be controlled by a giant radar net, run on a continent-wide basis by multiple electronic brain. Initially I was going to rate this as more or less true. However, it seems when I read around that some interpreted this electronic brain not just as organising, as acting as ground control to the planes, but also actually flying them in place of a pilot, in which case it hasn't happened. Interpreting what exactly people mean by their predictions is actually a fairly common problem in looking at and reviewing predictions of the future. Finally, at the end of his predictions, Heinlein gives a list of things we won't get soon, if ever. Travel through time. Travel faster than the speed of light. Radio transmission of matter. Man-like robots with man-like reactions. Laboratory creation of life. Real understanding of what thought is and how it is related to matter. Scientific proof of personal survival after death. Nor a permanent end to war. Most of these issues are pretty unchanged since the 50s. I've seen some criticism of them as simply stating the obvious, but the truth of the matter is that many did believe at the time that at least some of them would have been accomplished by the year 2000. Read any piece of old science fiction. Probably the issue on which there has been the most progress since the 50s is man-like robots with man-like reactions. And even there, we will likely have to wait at least a couple more decades. There is one interesting issue that Heinlein makes a couple of predictions about that has almost been forgotten now, but which was once one of the biggest environmental concerns globally. 6. We'll all be getting a little hungry by and by. 18. Fish and yeast will become our principal sources of protein. Beef will be a luxury. Lamb and mutton will disappear. He elaborates further on this in the short story, where he basically says that the reason for this is that there'll be too many people. This is an idea that was incredibly popular all throughout the latter half of the 20th century. Basically the concept that due to population growth we were soon going to see worldwide famines. This panic probably reached its peak with the publication of The Population Bomb by Paul R. Ehrlich, in which he argued that hundreds of millions would starve unless population growth was halted, and recommended, amongst other things, mandatory sterilization and making food aid to third world countries conditional on them limiting population growth. At the time it was the subject of enormous gloom and doom amongst those who considered such things. Now, we have more than 7 billion people on the planet, and world hunger is much less common than it was in Heinlein's day. Yay for the Green Revolution, I guess. Finally, we look at social changes. Social changes is one area in which old science fiction is often mocked for. It's often said that they presented all sorts of bizarre and wonderful technological changes, but with the social mores of the 50s. I think this is a lot less true of old science fiction than people often believe, but let us look at how Heinlein does. 2. Contraception and control of diseases, revising relations between the sexes to an extent that will change our entire social and economic structure. I don't think anyone can contest this. We might debate if it is a good or bad thing, but it has certainly happened. However, one can't quite give Heinlein's full marks nonetheless, since when you read the rest of the article, it becomes clear that Heinlein was imagining even more drastic changes than actually occurred, such as nudity no longer being taboo. In this attached story, in which the reader visits his granddaughter of the year 2000, she is depicted as wandering around her home stark naked, which, if you know Heinlein, is really not surprising, as the guy was a pervert. In general, he seems to have imagined a complete collapse of all, or almost all, sexual taboos, and despite the enormous changes of the past 70 years, that hasn't happened. 4. It is utterly impossible that the United States will start a preventive war. We will fight when attacked, either directly or in a territory we have guaranteed to defend. It would take a very generous interpretation of American behaviour over the past 70 years to argue for this. I'm going to mark it as completely wrong. 7. The cult of the phony in art will disappear. So-called modern art will be discussed only by psychiatrists. If only. I think this is an obvious example of a prediction that expresses a wish rather than a reasoned extrapolation. 15. We will not achieve a world state in the predictable future. Nevertheless, communism will vanish from this planet. Correct, and mostly correct. This is actually kind of interesting, since only a few years before, Heinlein had supported the idea of a world state as the only hope for human survival after the creation of the atom bomb. It was a very popular idea in science fiction. Indeed, I think I may do a whole video about the idea of the world state in our culture, how big it was around the middle of the last century, especially in science fiction, and how it seems to have completely disappeared. Suffice it to say that Heinlein wins here. On communism, he mostly wins. The USSR is gone. The great communist parties of Western Europe and the rest of the world, which in the 50s still were hoped, or feared, that they might seize power, have mostly faded. A few nations such as China still have a communist party in power, but even they have a very capitalist economy. Interestingly, when he reassessed many of his predictions in the 80s, Heinlein did a complete 180 on this prediction, fearing that communism might seize control of the entire globe, which I guess goes to show that second thoughts aren't always best. 16. Increasing mobility will disenfranchise a majority of the population. About 1990, a constitutional amendment will do away with state lines while retaining the semblance. Hasn't happened? I don't know enough about American politics to comment further. 19. Mankind will not destroy itself, nor will civilization be destroyed. Correct. Unless you think this is a very unambitious prediction, remember that Heinlein was making it just 7 years after the creation of the atomic bomb, in an atmosphere that many predicted the world was soon to end. Although it's worth noting that this wasn't because Heinlein didn't expect a nuclear war. Indeed, he did seem to expect one. In the rest of the article, it makes it clear that some sort of nuclear war will likely happen, but civilization will nonetheless survive. I don't know if this makes him an optimist or a pessimist. At any rate, there was no nuclear war and civilization did survive. Go us! So, we've looked at and judged the predictions and one question remains. So what? Can we draw any conclusions? I think one can easily see that a lot of these predictions are pretty wrong. Not all, but a fair amount. This is very unsurprising, as predicting the future is hard. I wouldn't particularly expect anyone else to have done better. But what is more interesting is that they are systematically wrong, and systematically wrong in the wrong direction. You see, Heinlein thinks he's being conservative. He says so in the article, and Heinlein was a smart guy. So how did a smart guy who thought he was being conservative end up making such radical predictions? One might just say that Heinlein is guilty of being overly optimistic, of confusing the future he would like with the likely future, and in some cases I think this is clearly the case. Take his insistence that aliens will be found on Mars. Even at the time, enough was known to make this unlikely. Not impossible, but unlikely. But it was an exciting idea, and he went for it. But I don't think it's true that Heinlein is biased simply by being too optimistic. After all, some of his predictions are clearly too pessimistic. For example, expecting nuclear war and widespread starvation. Rather, I think his predictions are biased in the direction of being dramatic. This is of course to be expected from a storyteller, and has been the bane of predictions of the future for centuries. Every generation wants to think that it is the hinge of history, on the verge of either an ascension into utopia or a fall into dystopia. Predictions that follow a more or less middle path are less interesting, both to make and read, and thus get little attention. But I think there is a deeper problem. You see, Heinlein isn't just making these predictions up. He has a methodology, and looking at that methodology, I think we can draw a few lessons. So here is Heinlein's methodology, in his own words. What are the rules of prophecy, if any? Look at the graph shown here. The solid curve is what has been going on this past century. It represents many things: use of power, speed of transport, numbers of scientific and technical workers, advancing communication, average miles travelled per person per year, advances in mathematics, the rising curve of knowledge. Call it the curve of human achievement. What is the correct way to project this curve into the future? Despite everything, there is a stubborn, common sense tendency to project it along dotted line number 1, like the patent official of 100 years ago who quit his job because everything had already been invented. Even those who don't expect the slowing up at once tend to expect us to reach a point of diminishing returns, dotted line number 2. Very daring minds are willing to predict that we will continue our present rate of progress, dotted line number 3, a tangent. But the proper way to project the curve is dotted line number 4, because there is no reason, mathematical, scientific or historical, to expect that curve to flatten out, or to reach a point of diminishing returns, or simply go on as a tangent. The correct projection, by all known facts today, is for the curve to go on up indefinitely with increasing steepness. The timid little predictions earlier in this article actually belong to curve 1, or at most to curve 2. You can count on changes in the next 50 years at least 8 times as great as the changes of the past 50. The age of science has not yet opened. Heinlein's technique is thus to assume that all trends will continue as they are at present, and if they are at present accelerating, they will accelerate forever. And many of his errors come from this. Population was growing very fast in his day, and agricultural productivity was growing less fast, hence mass starvation. The last 50 years had seen planes go from the Wright Flyer to jet aircraft, so the next 50 would see equally large changes. He correctly predicted the sexual revolution, since he assumed that the liberalizing of sexual norms that were already happening would continue and accelerate. But he overestimated its completeness, since his graphs could not anticipate a backlash or slowdown. To him, everything was, and always must be, an exponential curve. But history also contains S-curves, and trends that don't match any curve at all. Actually, technological developments often follow an S-shaped curve of very slow progress until some breakthrough happens, which is followed by a period of rapid progress as the breakthrough is properly developed and perfected, until we eventually reach the limits of the technology. Failing to realize this led to Heinlein's failure in many of his predictions. So, can we accurately predict the future by assuming that trends will come to an end and the future will be boring? No, it's not that simple, because trends do sometimes continue far longer than you would believe possible, and they sometimes are exponential, and sometimes they stop and then suddenly start again. What I would say is to be skeptical of any prediction of the future that relies purely on mathematical graphs and doesn't give proper reasons for why trends must continue or end. And even then, to remember that they are likely wrong. Predicting the future is, like I said, hard. You know, reading all this makes me a little melancholy. I love old science fiction, and I have to admit that part of me almost feels nostalgic for the world they predicted, if it is possible to be nostalgic for something that never existed. One wonders if the world they predicted could have existed, if we made some kind of mistake during the past 70 years that gave us our own instead. But for better or worse, this is the world we got. Still, it is ours, so as Heinlein himself said, we ought to stick around and try to make the best of it. Maybe we can yet achieve some of the things that have been delayed.